Welcome to the Ontology Summit 2025. I'm currently testing the streaming capability. So at the moment, I'm supposed to be streaming this session on YouTube, but it seems like the streaming session is delayed relative to the Zoom meeting. So the formal meeting will begin at noon, so it'll be a little while before people start showing up. Hello, Alex, Mike.
I'm ready to try recording.
Yeah,
Ah,
it's streaming right now on YouTube,
super. Great.
and according to YouTube, let's see how many. We have 3 people watching.
Super. It's interesting that there is possibility ask moderator to write to the cloud on recording menu.
Um, I'm recording right now.
Yeah, I know, but what does it mean cloud?
Yeah, I can record on my computer or on the cloud. I have a choice.
Ah,
I'm
I see.
currently recording to my
Do you
computer.
know, do you need me to record?
No, it's recording.
Ah, super.
But
Okay.
yeah, you should record. Go ahead.
Then I shouldn't.
Yeah, you should.
Ah, should.
Yeah,
Then
go ahead
I
and
send you request. I send you request.
yes, and I allowed it.
Okay. Where is this button? Ah, now I have this button. Yeah, super, it works. I hope my connection is good enough.
Mark, hi. Mike.
Hey, Ken.
So I was just explaining that we're streaming to YouTube right now.
What is YouTube reference?
YouTube, it sees the same things that we see, but delayed.
I mean, is it possible to put it into the chat?
You can chat on if you're on YouTube. There is a live chat. You just can't participate. You can't. You can't unmute yourself on YouTube.
I mean, if you put here our reference to YouTube channel, it might be interesting for others.
Yeah, well, just go to YouTube and it's the Ontology Summit channel, I believe. Okay, I guess we could start. We have a dozen people. All right, let me formally begin the meeting. So welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2025 on conceptualization, analysis, and formalization. Today is the 19th of March, 2025. And we have just last week finished the first two tracks, and we are now at the first synthesis track. So, and I'm also pleased to tell you that we are now streaming live to YouTube at the same time. So, yeah, that looks like the right link. And what I'm going to do is begin with a topic outline and then move to a general discussion. So let's see if this works. Yes. So there were a lot of topics covered at the first two tracks. So it would be very difficult in a short period of time to do it all justice. So I'm going to be doing a very sketchy outline of the topics that were covered. And starting at the beginning is, what is an ontology? So here we are. It is a specification of a conceptualization. But of course, you have to explain what all of that means. And that was taken care of in our keynote session by Nicola Guarino. And we found that conceptualization, analysis, and formalization are all important roles that are played in developing an ontology. And the conceptualization involves both cognitively relevant as well as relevant relations, entities, and relations. But a key thing is for the intended models to match the model of the theory. So if we develop a theory but it doesn't match conceptualization, that can lead to a number of problems, such as the false understanding. Two individuals who think they understand each other, but in fact don't. So the two ways in which you might be incorrect are listed in this diagram derived from that talk. You can have unintended models, which is loss of precision, or omitted models, which is loss of accuracy. They both have both of them have their problems when you have a loss of precision or a loss of accuracy. On the other hand, sometimes it's good to deliberately be imprecise. So you do have a loss of precision, but this favors reuse at the cost of reducing interoperability. And the various axioms have different effects. They can reduce ambiguities and misunderstandings, but they can generate new knowledge. And so they can affect both sides of this loss of accuracy and precision. So one important aspect is if we are going to be disagreeing, we should be explicit for that disagreement. And then Giancarlo Gazzardi spoke at length about what he called unpacking or explaining the descriptions and revealing the commitments. It's an important point is that just being symbolic does not imply that what you've written is self-explanatory. Helps a little, but you really need to unpack relationships and roles in order to gain an understanding. So now the term truth maker and truth bearers came up a lot in the first two tracks. A truth bearer is any statement or proposition that can bear truth. Truth. It's either true or false. So it's a bearer of truth, possible bearer of truth. And truth makers are responsible for giving the truth bearers their, their truth value, whether it's true or false. Now, there are a number of tools that you can use during the ontological analysis. These are some of the major tools. There's been a number of discussions on the forum about this, and there can be others. I would just say that these are the major ones. So anyone who is going to be doing a detailed ontological analysis must be familiar with all of these. It seems we have a yes, Mark, I did. This is regarding the streaming. When I started the streaming, I was watching it. That's why I'm on twice. So I can see what's on the stream at the same time as seeing what's on Zoom. And there's a definite delay between the two. Now, models are of different kinds, just as there are different theories. So we can basically see a model as being the model plays the role of truth making. It establishes the relationship to some reality of some kind. Whereas theory is more of the framework, the logical framework for the model. Of course, model is also used in other ways in logic, so it's a somewhat ambiguous term. In any case, the notions can be classified as descriptive, explanatory, and predictive, so that it's kind of the strength of the model increases as you go from descriptive through predictive. And now BFO is, or is claimed to be, the ontology of the common sense world. And classical physics is, roughly speaking, a proper part of the domain of BFO.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So if BFO is supposed to be common sense, how can we claim that it's a model for science in general and especially for physics? Because, I mean, the first thing that, or at least my understanding of science is the goal is to get beyond common sense. And we usually discard common sense, as we do science. And I mean, nowhere is that more true than in physics, but it's true in other branches of science as well. I mean, Darwinism is very unintuitive. So I find that very confusing.
Well, actually, Barry made the point that you do leave the domain of common sense as you go to very low and very high granularities. So the BFO is kind of more like a starting point. And I think BFO was actually created for biology originally. And Barry and his colleagues are busy working on trying to express physics in terms of BFO, which may involve some, updates to BFO.
Okay.
But that's a very good point about this. Yes. Okay.
Thanks.
And then there was this very enlightening Michael Greninger's session on Hilbert's sixth problem. And so, do ontologies solve Hilbert's sixth problem? That would be quite remarkable if it did. And in a way, yes, it does get quite a ways toward doing it. And one nice thing about the approach, the colore approach, is that if you find that you cannot express your theory in terms of colore, the combination of theories in colore, then you've discovered new mathematics and you can add it, colore. So this is very interesting aspect of this. I'll talk about that a little later. So then an interesting point are observer effects. There are two kinds of observer effects. And this is important for ontology because you have this process of going from your reality or your domain and making judgments to produce your conceptualization and then your model. Now, so you need to fit your judgments with reality. And you can have two different kinds of effects depending on the direction. Reality can constrain your judgments. I mean, you don't at least theory, have control about physical reality, and it is what it is. But for other kinds of domains, you can actually have it the other way. Your judgment can affect reality, and perhaps even in physics, by delineating the chunks of what is real or what you are judging. For other domains, I gave examples where you go further, you actually can alter reality of your domain. So that being the case, we have to be a little careful. Our ontology development can actually affect reality through effects on judgment, as mentioned above, and on non-commutativity. In other words, the order in which we develop the different modules of a large ontology will affect what we end up with as our ontology. These effects, the order is non-commutative. If you approach your ontology development in a different order, you may very well get a very different ontology. Okay, back in 1960, Wigner was impressed by the accuracy and empirical predictions of mathematical theories for physics. But in fact, science actually answers comparatively few problems. Physics, which seems so extremely accurate and successful, is actually only accurate for a very narrowly defined collection of problems within physics. As you move away from those narrowly defined problems, you find that these theories are not as successful, not as easily applied. Barry Smith gave some examples of this, but even at the time of Wigner back in 1960, Gelfand, Pillai, Roberto Poli were pointing out that other fields were not so easily circumscribed. And so they were not so effective, so unreasonably effective. But it's interesting to see that scientists continue to rediscover this. During the in the forum, somebody listed an article that was written quite recently, basically saying what Gelfand said about biology back in the 60s. So it can be a real problem. We have to be a little careful, not to assume that we are going to create an ontology that's going to solve all the problems. Uh-oh, something went wrong with this image. Sorry about that. The diagram came from the presentation by Sawa and Majumdar. If you go to his presentation, you can see that diagram a little more clearly. I'll try to fix it in the a little later. Sorry about that. In any case, generating ontologies is a dynamic cycle that is akin to the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop, which includes processes of abduction, deduction, induction, analogy, and testing. And we learned a lot about this during the talk by Sawa and Majumdar. The process should combine both generative, sort of non-symbolic, and symbolic methods. Thank you, Alakan. Has shown the actual diagram. So consistency. Well, okay, logic should be consistent after all. And while there may be problems with, we may accept a certain amount of inconsistency in our conceptualizations. In logic, it's not so good because if the logic is inconsistent, then you really cannot infer anything. Now, back in 1891, Cantor made the startling discovery that mathematics is inconsistent. And when you look at it carefully, the difficulty was that naive set theory allows unrestricted comprehension. That is to say, you can define a set in any way you want. Make any predicate and you can that will define a set. Well, that doesn't work. The simplest kind of set you could define that way would be the set where the predicate is true, set of everything. Cantor in 1891 found that the set of everything is inconsistent. It leads to a contradiction. So Cantor and others developed solutions by restricting the ability to define sets in a number of different ways. So modern mathematics makes use of one of these, but there are certainly other possibilities. It's interesting that Russell, who started his work 10 years after Cantor discovered the inconsistency in mathematics, is often credited with the one who found this. In fact, Russell cited and credited Cantor with this. Anyway, so it's kind of an indication of how mathematicians are not really all that careful about giving credit. But in any case, what about us? What about ontologies? Could they have the same inconsistency? So, for example, how should classes be defined? Should we construct them bottom up, extensionally? Or should we allow being more conceptual in a top down fashion by necessary and sufficient conditions? That's the intentional approach. Now, the first approach is consistent. I mean, that's restricted comprehension. The second might not be. We have to be a little more careful to be sure that what we are doing will still be consistent. And we had a lovely talk by Royston Linnebo, where he discussed these issues. And I think he gave us a lot of insights into how we should be careful about our definitions. After Oystein's talk, we had this talk by Kit Fine about truthmaker semantics. And this is a concept he developed. And he pointed out that it differs from both possible worlds and situation semantics. The reason that possible worlds are perhaps not the best approach for semantics is that the possible worlds contain much that is irrelevant to the truth making of a particular state. Possible worlds, after all, are whole worlds with lots in them. And so they contain a great deal that really is irrelevant to a particular statement, proposition. Situation semantics is a little better. It restricts to a state that is part of the world. So this makes things a bit more relevant, but you can still have irrelevancies within a situation. Truthmaker semantics employs states, but it requires exact relevance in truth making. And so there could be interesting aspects of that, which we might be able to discuss as we continue the summit or at the synthesis today. Okay, I grabbed a few challenges and opportunities from the talk so far. This is my last slide. And the framework for ontology generalized to other logics and semantics. And the framework that we have that Nicola so wonderfully and beautifully expressed still makes use of specific logic and semantics. Shouldn't we be able to extend or generalize this to these other logics and semantics, like truthmaker semantics? Another aspect is, as we saw, there's a succession of theories that are stronger, descriptive down to predictive. Could we develop ontologies incrementally by progressing to the more formal, to the stronger theories? Gary has done some work on this, and unfortunately he couldn't attend today. There's also caution about observer effects, and we should be aware of them during conceptualization and analysis. And could calore restore the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and other fields? Perhaps that's what was missing in the problems that were raised by all these authors like Gelfand. Then another aspect is another challenge is whether ontologies could exploit Yoneda style definitions. These are definitions that are not about entities themselves, but about how those entities sit within their framework. So there are many examples of this actually that already exist. And I mentioned a few of them in my talk, and no doubt there are many others. The question is whether ontologies could start to be more systematic about exploiting these. Mathematicians certainly been doing this kind of thing for a long time. And it's been very fruitful. finally, there are the issues that I raised concerning ontology consistency. So I threw in a few references, and that's all for my outline. So let's open up to discussion. Everyone should be able to unmute.
I have a remark actually. Throughout this summit, I guess what I realized is there is like two ways, so to speak. One includes the induction to their framework, and the one does not. I guess you also mentioned that there were like two types, so to speak, like when the people are approaching to the ontologies. Like for example, the John Sowa and his colleague, for example, they are including the induction so that they are saying the ontologies can never be like a consistent, and then they should change dynamically through the time. But the other scholars, for example, the Giancarlo, they are more or less looking like static, or so to say, like a fixated ontologies. But within the practice, also I'm doing this practice in the social sciences, basically, and the business perspective. And from my point of view, it is nearly impossible to use the fixed definitions in the business, because there is no way to somehow justify what you have found from the field, so to speak. But if I show them, for example, if I have such data and through this data I got these concepts, and then through these concepts I combine them, and then I somehow give them the inferred relationships, then they are happy about it. But if I show them some fixated ontology or something, they have actually no idea, first of all, and second of all, they don't like, so to speak, to assert them some propositions.
Very good point. Very good point indeed. We have to accept that our ontologies should always be dynamic. And but how do we do that? I mean, the framework we're using now is really static. So I think it would be really
If I may?
helpful if we have, perhaps in one of our later sessions, we might actually be able to address this issue in more detail. Yes, another?
Kenneth, regarding this notion of dynamism, we have to remember that what we are actually talking about are engineered entities. We're not doing philosophy here for the most part, though that can be fun. And the goal of having an ontology, among other things, is to support information systems and their interoperability. Now, if a company, a large corporation, is going to implement an ontology, there's a cost involved. And making changes to an ontology is certainly easier than making changes to a relational database, but there's still a cost involved. So we have to keep in mind when we talk about this notion of dynamism, that is changes to the ontology, what's actually changing? Are you removing constructs from your ontology? Are you adding constructs? Are you adding additional constraints on the existing constructs? But in any case, there's an overhead to doing that, which, as I mentioned, is probably less than if you want to make a change to a relational database. Just a thought.
Point, yes. Relational database, people will, of course, say, yes, you can update a schema, but people are reluctant to do that, or at least not reluctant. They're reluctant to do it in a way that is, should I say, correct. Having come from the database field, I've seen schemas that are just appallingly bad. Every time they need a new feature, they add a new column or whatever, and they leave the old one. So you accumulate all this stuff. So you'll find half a dozen different properties all expressing the same concept over time. It becomes
Yes.
such a mess. I mean, maybe ontologies are better, but we still have the same issue of dealing with the legacy systems. Yes, Todd?
Well, that's a different issue, if you like. Are you referring to a legacy ontology based system or a legacy information system that's trying to accommodate the use of ontologies?
Oh, the legacy system. And these days, legacy could be
Oh,
2 years old. Uh,
yes.
so, yeah, that's kind of, yeah, that's what I had in mind. Um, so, any other?
Maybe further comment. I don't know who talked actually. You mentioned Todd, but is it the who spoke with it? But anyway, so that's the answer to him basically. If the process what we are doing requires a decision making or some critical assessment, then the ontology's change is, so to speak, much more important than if the change does not matter to in this case, for example, to the manager. But I have another example where a friend of mine is doing for the health area, so that they are actually giving out recommendations to the doctors. And every month the doctors are coming up and then they are deciding basically which class should be there and which class should be eliminated based on their experiences. In their case, it is really important to change the structure, and also the software system also should be compatible with that structure all the time. And that's what actually they are trying to do. But in management case, it's most of the time just, if it is not so important that we are not changing it. But if they say, yeah, it is crucial for us for the decision making, then we are actually changing the schema as well as the visualizations, basically, which I am providing.
Yes.
Are those changes that you're discussing part of an existing system, or they are in the process of developing an ontology that will be implemented in an information system that will be used by the medical professionals?
It is actually, there exists already a system, like a recommendation system, basically like an expert system, you would say. But it is changing all the time, I would say. Not all the classes, but most of the classes for sure. Especially new, for example, when new virus comes up, they just want to add it basically, and they also want a class which represents this new thing, which I don't know, whatever they are talking about this virus, so that whatever class name they are referring to.
Well, as Kenneth pointed out in his example about relational databases, you can muck up an ontology very easily also once you start throwing things in willy-nilly. And this is one reason why you want to make use of, say, a foundational ontology, whether it's Dolce, BFO, UFO, or something else. It helps in guiding your decisions as to how you should represent some entity.
Yeah, on that issue, I actually started to develop a system where you could do bottom-up ontology development. The idea was that you would have this, well, smart spelling and grammar checker where that you would make available to practitioners, say, doctors and radiology, all the various practitioners and specialties within medicine. And I mean, these practitioners have complained to me a lot about how there's people in their specialty are not understood by people in other specialties, even though they're using the same words. And I said, well, there's a way that you could deal with that. And I thought there was by developing this kind of system. And I even had students working on it. And we started to make some progress, but it kind of got derailed by the fact that by the modern AI systems being so statistically based rather than grammar based. They don't understand what you're writing. They only know statistically what the next word should be. And I needed a system that would actually understand what the people were typing in so that it could realize that you've done something that isn't already in the ontology. I can point this out to you and send it off to a committee of individuals who are in charge of, elected by the specialty to do the work on ontologies, on the ontology for their specialty. And so it was all bottom up, not top down. So it wasn't like the government is saying, these are the terms you're going to use. And you have to do everything in this. No, the doctors themselves are the ones who are creating the terminology and the meanings behind what they're doing, and they're doing it dynamically, constantly introducing more to your ontology. As I say, it was a very interesting idea. It was a total failure at the time. Perhaps
Kenneth, when
we could revisit it.
talked about bottom up, are you referring to labels and natural language terminology, or are you referring to something else? That is, if you have a
Basically,
collection of data that you'd like to organize, you're just looking at the labels and seeing how they are being interpreted relative to that data and ignoring everything else?
I'm not ignoring everything else, but I am focusing on the labels. That's how people communicate with other people.
Well, hopefully, we haven't found a better way yet.
Oh, in one of the things I did, I looked at data for the intensive care units, which included the comments that are being made by nurses and doctors and radiologists about the patients. The challenge was to predict the outcome 48 hours in advance. And it was a challenge that was given to various people, and they all made use of, except for me, everybody was making use of the data, the tests that were being performed, and all of that. And I only made use of the comments, what people were saying. And my prediction was just as good as everyone else's. The words that people used were really effective. So it was kind of surprising too. Like one word that turned out to be quite effective at determining the outcome, that is to say, whether the patient is going to live or die, was the word nephew.
Huh.
Nephew and niece. So if you use nephew or niece, that's really bad.
That's something.
And when I mentioned that to people in the field, they couldn't be. And they said, no, wait, of course it is. The nurse is saying, contact your relatives who are not close, in your family. They're making a judgment now about what the outcome is going to be. Um,
Kenneth, getting back to the issue of labels, that is natural language labels that are important or
Mhm.
critical for human communication, have you ever come across any situation where when you try to represent those distinctions of that entity that uses that label, the label itself conveys constraints that may not be consistent with what the entity actually is, or how you actually distinguish the entity? A misnamed entity.
yes, but I was talking about terminology used in a specialty, so it's a relatively constrained and narrow use of the terminology. Um,
How do you
so
formally
it's
represent those constraints then? If you want to use that ontology in, say, a slightly larger domain to promote interoperability with, say, other specialties.
yeah, the idea was that so for example, when a radiologist wanted to communicate um, with the surgeon, um, the two would talk to each other about the terminology that they're using, so that they could actually determine how you should translate within a context from the one term to the other. Um,
And these are humans, though, right? That were doing the
these are
conversation, the
humans.
translation. Okay,
Yeah.
but again,
Now, of course, I suppose people would like to use AI, but yeah, my intention was to be people talking about this bottom up. Um, so, Janet, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think there are interesting connections between some of the questions raised here and the issues you've talked about from the presentations. The status of BFO and what it is that they actually discovered, Barry and Jobst, about how modern physics is not doesn't correspond to a common sense, what they think of as common sense BFO world. Well, but I think that they actually, that's a really interesting result, but they showed that BFO isn't common sense. And, common sense has been the holy grail in AI, and there is none. And they just sort of legislate, they say, well, BFO is common sense, but we know that, as I think Alex commented on the forum, that people don't respond to it as if it's common sense, but Barry says that it is. Now, what it was that they found the terminology in a field. So it's actually more middle out. When they started with their domains, the mapping, I forget the geolocation, whatever they did, and the medical stuff. They started out middle out with the terminology of the domains, and then added on an upper level that Barry thought was appropriate. But so maybe the middle out, and this also goes with John. The point that John keeps making is that it's the middle out theories that really matter. It's the middle out where your specialists actually communicate with each other, and then so fleshing that out with the bottom, with the data, like, so you can show a practitioner, this is the terminology you use in your field. Here's a new concept that we formed from this data by putting this together and seeing that this is a useful concept. The top-down part, maybe the upper level ontology, there's a role for it, but it should be providing the quality control. It should be providing the cleaning up, so that schemas don't just get overloaded with a bunch of stuff, but it should so this is, I don't know, this is, I've long thought this, and it's, I think I haven't really articulated it, but the upper level ontology should provide the ways for people to do quality control on the more organic, bottom up and middle out standardizations of terms and concepts that arise in their practices, whatever they are.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually think middle out was what I was really doing. Um, when I was looking at biology papers in one of my projects, I was really impressed by what a large fraction of those papers start out by defining a new term. They all, there's so many of them that begin by, their abstract begins with a new term entirely, and then in parentheses, the abbreviation for it, and then explaining what it is and what they're going to do in their paper about this new term. It's so common. And there are hundreds of thousands of papers published every year. Consider how many terms are being introduced, how dynamic that field is. It's really impressive.
Yeah, so we shouldn't fight it. We should try to figure out how to support it.
Yeah.
I think one of the in early on the conceptualization that didn't the specification of a conceptualization definition of an ontology didn't have the word shared there. That I know has been debated whether it should be a shared conceptualization, but it's the sharing that you're getting at again, where people need to communicate maybe across specializations or communicate to new people, new concepts within their domain. Sharing is really key for the stability of a term and concept relationship. And so that also gets at how well the client or public will do in accepting a new concept, and how long it should be in the schema. Stability comes from being shared. The more shared it is, the more stable. So the shared should probably be emphasized on the conceptualization. Also, we're not using the conceptual, logical, physical distinction, which also helps with the question of stability. And I'm realizing now you just said something that was relevant in this morning's presentation about stability. So sharing and stability, and going from the conceptual, which is maybe the most dynamic, I don't know, to the logical, which is Todd's point about things getting encoded and set into rules, and then into the physical, where they really get embodied in artifacts. There.
Actually, another thing I came up with in my proposal way back when was question: how do you compensate these people to do all this work? Why should they do it? And so part of my proposal was that if your new term and your new translation is accepted by the field, it'll be a publication and you'll get credit for it. And so people in biology and medicine love to give credit and to get credit for what they do. It's remarkable. So by basically having a system that automatically does this would make people eager to be part of the process and to do the work necessary.
Mhm.
Um, that's another aspect that, you know, maybe how much do we think in those terms right now? How do we get people to help us produce these ontologies?
Right.
So there's a ready-made
Well-
way that we can do that.
Right. So it's like a credit web needs to be a layer in the semantic web.
Yeah, should be there.
Well, Kenneth, I think that sounds very much like an academic point of view
Oh, these
in terms of the
people in medicine love
compensation
this stuff.
mechanism.
Every doctor wants to be published. They
Oh,
really do.
that's not true. Mine don't.
Yours don't?
No.
Oh, I don't know. I
But
guess the
I
doctors
want to
that
go back to the
I
issue.
dealt with were at the NIH, and I guess mine
Ah,
was this is a case of selection bias. Uh,
yeah, it gets to that issue of getting grants and so on. But I want to go back to the points that Janet made or brought up. I think you did too, the notion of common sense. Barry uses that term prolifically. And for the most part, it's a way to sweep all sorts of details and ugly things that you don't want to address under the rug. One of the things that Barry has come to recognize, particularly when he went to do the physics ontology, was the issue of scale or granularity. How much granularity do you want to support, or what scale do you want to support? So if you're doing classical physics, things like BFO, Dolce, they work fine in terms of helping you organize your thoughts of the entities you want to represent. But once you get to smaller scales, again, if we're thinking of spatial scales as being somewhat linear, then you run into problems very quickly. If your ontology wants to represent the entire universe, or at least a solar system, and also all the molecules in a particular metal crystal, you run into problems very quickly. So the issue of scale or granularity is an ongoing problem, and to some extent that's swept under the rug when you use common sense. Whose
Mhm.
common sense? What time
what
period and when?
is what is common sense? I
Right.
mean, what's intuitive
Good
for one
question.
person
It
isn't intuitive
depends.
for another. I
Right.
mean, it's
And is it common sense just for humans, or is it all mammals, or do we include bacteria too?
right. I don't see it as a really well-defined term.
Oh, no,
I
it's
mean,
not.
others might chime in on this. Maybe there is. I mean, there's this idea that physics, you know, quantum physics is not intuitive. It's not part of common sense. Well, it could be. Maybe other people don't feel that way. I had the strange experience of learning physics from the quantum point of view first. And when I finally encountered classical physics, I found it really unintuitive. It didn't work for me.
Mhm.
Quantum mechanics was was
Right.
for me common sense.
Right.
So it's not clear to me that common sense is the same from person to person, even.
Right.
Although I
But
mean,
that
supposedly
is
it's
the
common to everyone, but I don't know.
but that's the yeah, it's a fig leaf, and it's as I said, it's the holy grail, as John McCarthy said in I think 2006 paper. And it's and they talk about how, well, AIs now don't have common sense. So if only we could get common sense into them, they can do these impressive things with text, but they still don't have common sense. But it's an odd phrase, and it's used. I think whenever we hear it, we should expect that, hold on to your wallet kind of a warning.
Well,
I think that
that's,
the interesting thing is, yeah.
I should just add, that's good, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do work on trying
Oh
to
no, but I think
deal with
actually,
nonsense.
the what Jobst and Barry discovered is that it needs to be deprecated, as instead of relying on that phrase, that we should ask, what are the shared conceptualizations? If there are shared conceptualizations and shared terminology, that's great. But we shouldn't assume that they're there. And you raised the question of a whole. Is a whole an entity? What about a shadow? Is a shadow an entity? These are common sense concepts and terms, but we're sort of past the naive entitation. I think, to use Ralph Gerard's phrase, that we can't just assume, well, let's look at the entities in the world and put labels on them, and that will solve all of our AI or knowledge management problems. What we need is, what are people's conceptualizations? What are their, how do they measure them? How do they use them? And very important, what are the terms they use? What's the scope? So it's partly scale, but it's not just scale, because of specializations and because of different communities of practice, because of things like shadows and holes. So the idea of a naive entitation of the world that we can put labels on is, I think, maybe that's one of our big conclusions for the 20 years of the summit, is that we should move beyond that to a more sophisticated question of what are shared conceptualizations and terminologies. What are the ways, how are these ideas operationalized, so that we can communicate to others what it is that we're referring to, that kind of thing.
Well, Mark has a number of comments in the chat that are quite interesting. I should add, nothing is off topic at a synthesis session.
I feel like I'm drifting off topic. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think it's fine. Somebody mentioned to me that common sense intuitions can interfere with the learning of scientific concepts. I think somebody did a study of the Monty Hall problem and found that pigeons could learn to do that problem correctly faster than people could. That pigeons, in some sense, are smarter than people.
I
But
never
rather, I think smarter is the wrong term
underestimated
to use.
pigeons.
What? Mark?
I never underestimate pigeons. That goes back to my early psych days.
Yeah,
well, actually, the Monty Hall problem is one of my, I'm obsessed with people misunderstanding that. I think the issue is that we interpret it culturally. Pigeons don't interpret it culturally. We interpret it as a con man who only offers you a chance to change when he knows that you've already selected the car. The most framings of the Monty Hall problem don't say that he must offer you the chance to change every time. And so our instinctive treatment of a game like that is he's trying to con us by offering us this chance. So it is very interesting to think of pigeons doing it, because they're not imposing a cultural interpretation on it, whereas we're using that as well. But Mark, why don't you talk about some of those things that you have there?
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Well, it's not well formed, so I don't really want to go too far with this, except to say I just think that the challenge of building out what we're calling those middle ontologies is where the action is for the profession. It's where human computer interfaces can make up the gaps in the ontologies where the APIs can be built by the engineers to do interfaces to relational databases or traditional expert systems. And you do need to build on the foundational things, but that's really not where the work is. The work is in the boundary areas where the new stuff is happening, and that's where automation for decision support is helpful. That's why I keep coming back to the sessions to learn more about this and refresh my memory, because that is where the action is. My day job now is in risk management, and the places where the risks are emerging domains at the intersection of NLP, use of these large language models by enterprises, and how much documentation can be ingested by the training materials and whether to use them. So really core foundational things in the ontology side of this have to connect to those domain specific things that we would try to use for building RAGs and so on. But I feel like my ability to contribute to this particular summit's pretty limited.
But that point is, I think the point there is critical, that, or at least the way you started, I think, is where the action is. In the Gruber's original definition of the shared, or he didn't say shared, but a conceptualization of a specification of a conceptualization of a domain. Well, it's if one thinks of that as the distinctions that an agent needs to make in a domain in order to act competently or successfully or something, it should be tied to the distinctions are being made not just abstractly, academically, they're being made because of there's some kind of action that is that an intelligent agent, intelligence would mean that an appropriate distinction is being made. So that's one of the key forms of quality control, is to say do you have the distinctions in your domain that correspond to the actions, which actually goes back to the risk and opportunity, right? The two faces of the value for the appropriate actions in a domain. So I'm getting the feeling that there are pieces here of a more sophisticated view of ontologies for, I don't know, that bring in the action question, the value question, risk and opportunity, to take it from being an abstract academic question of labeling all the entities in the world to where is the action? What are the distinctions that need to be made in a domain in order to manage value?
Yeah, I agree. There are connections there. I put this use case, a sort of family of use cases, in the chat about how judges pick expert witnesses. There are a lot of constraints around expert testimony and the selection of them, and the constraints are partly in the legal system itself. But think about the challenge of somebody in an intellectual property litigation or a malpractice suit trying to understand the technology of these subspecializations, have to do with like titration rates or subspecialties inside a cancer drug that might be an experimental drug that somebody's agreed to be in a clinical trial. And so the legal frameworks are relatively static. That the domain knowledge is not. How do people recognize where the precipice of their own knowledge is, where they need to get help? Because we're used to operating in that domain of uncertainty. I forget who mentioned that earlier in the talk today, but this uncertainty role is a really important one to be able to address some real world uses of ontologies, I think.
Yeah, regarding this dynamic aspect of terminology, there's a logical fallacy called presentism. Presentism is viewing past events as if the current, as if current ideas and terminology and attitudes existed in those past during the past events. So it's it's remarkable how often this kind of fallacy occurs. So, I mean, that's another thing to kind of think about in our work. In fact, I saw an example of all things in the Harvard magazine where the author made a glaring mistake of presentism. But yeah, I mean, this is something to consider. I mean, how the people's attitudes, their ontologies, if you wish, their common sense, even a decade or so ago, can be very different from what it is now. And since a court case can go for that length of time, this makes it really difficult to make judgments by people in a jury who are not trained to do anything like this. Just ask our Supreme Court.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think this is. I was surprised at the extent to which this mistake is occurring these days. Just think about it. So, anyone else? Common sense.
So if along lines of what you're saying there, so we hear the phrase common sense, and we assume that it's that it has always had the same meaning. But you can see here that it was originally the fusion of the five senses. So it was not. So it's more of a robotics question of fusion, or general AI question of fusion. It's not. There's common knowledge, common sense knowledge, and if people use these phrases and they assume they're sort of interchangeable, but common knowledge would be clearer if you said common knowledge, but then you get back to the question of what's shared. Common knowledge is more clearly, maybe we can more clearly say that is shared within a community. Common sense sort of has it's an appeal to authority, that because we all have senses, we must have shared understanding of the world. But as these various discussions have showed here, we don't.
In any case, if all of our ontologies should be dynamic and should maintain previous versions, so that you can interpret past data correctly. So that's I think that's a point that can be made.
Right, provenance. There should be provenance. For
the provenance of data and the
Hey, Kenneth,
past versions of your ontology.
A question for both you and Janet regarding dynamic ontologies. By dynamism, something has changed. And my question would be, why would you change something? And this gets to the issue of quality control. If you've represented things in a quality fashion, why would you change it? Now, is the change, and I guess the question also is, how substantial is the change? Are you just adding or removing a distinction, or are you making very substantial changes to your representation? And if so, was there an issue of quality control with your first representation, or did your requirements change so substantially that you just misunderstood things?
Well, what are you representing is the question. If what you're representing has changed, then your representation should change. But it does come down to that that judgment.
Ah,
Now, in medicine,
okay, fair enough.
the meaning of terms like diseases, say autism, for example, that has changed dramatically over time. And
Hold on, Kenneth, that's a good point. That's a good point. What about this? So there has been this notion of autism, but what about autism has changed? Is it diagnosis? Is its mechanisms for realization, or something else, or more combination thereof?
well, that's where the unitist stuff comes in. It's what's surrounding it, the various properties and activities that occur in relationship to this term. Is perhaps the most important aspect of the term, not the term itself. And that continually changes. So you shouldn't
So you would
focus
be
just
adding
on the
on more
term.
things?
Yes,
So
Todd?
you would be adding more relations among existing entities, or adding new entities and new relations?
I guess both.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
I think
do
that's
the
one of the
entities
Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
do your entities there, do they if your entities are designating distinctions in your conceptualizations, then you should be able to add more and maintain some coherence by showing why these new distinctions have arisen in shared conceptualizations, for some group. If we assume that there's some entity in the world that we're trying to naively mirror, then I think that's where you get into trouble, is that the entity in the world, we assume that has some stability other than whereas the stability comes from the way people relate to the world. Right. So is autism a thing? I guess is it, if we're assuming that autism is a thing, then it should have stable properties. But if it's not a thing, if it's the center of this coalition of concepts and diagnoses, and has all these relatable ideas and terms and methods and treatments and whatever, then it's a constellation, and that can grow. And the quality control question is, can that grow coherently so that the way it grows doesn't just add noise?
Maybe I have an example of the real case where it occurred. For example, when I talked with the managers, they were talking that, I was asking what type of company you are. And then most of the time they were talking like, we are the first tier suppliers within this ecosystem, for example. But then I look at the data, and then when I look to the data, actually most of them are not the first tier suppliers. So that when I told them, hey, even though first tier suppliers, what do you mean by it? And then they were saying, if we are delivering to the original equipment manufacturer, which means that we are the first tier supplier. And then I am actually showing him that it's not the case. And then his actually whole conception changes. But what is the benefit of this? Because if I am, let's say, consulting a company, and this company actually tells me that they are the first tier supplier, I have a good indication that A, he is probably not the first tier supplier as he admits, or B, we are using the same term, but we are meaning something else. So that I'm checking if this thing actually occurs. If it's the thing, that I'm saying that, no, you are not the first tier supplier, so don't use that one. So that I am actually rejecting, let's say, his concept, so to speak, which he uses to further analyze more deeper, so to speak, through their ecosystem. Otherwise, they will create false actions based on their theories, which is through the empiricism. I'm showing him that his theory is not correct, so that he should not take that action. And in this case, the action is the decision making, for example, investing in some product ABC, whatever he is trying to do the decision for.
Example. Very good
Yeah,
example.
good example. And gets back to the precision accuracy question as well. The theories and models, precision accuracy, adding some concrete criteria to this equilibration.
We should probably close this session. So next week, we're going to begin track 3, and the Mike Bennett is the chair. He's not here, but I believe Mike Bennett is going to be presenting the first. Is going to be the chair of the whole track, and also is going to be speaking at the first session. So I think everyone, this is going to be very interesting. We're going to move on to the next track, and looking forward to a lot of interesting new things to learn. I think our first 2 tracks were certainly very interesting and informative. I think especially, I mean, you might say, well, you don't want to get too philosophical, but the truth is that you can learn from philosophers. They can give us insights that we can then make use of. So it's very nice that we had a track that had philosophers. But now let's move on to more pragmatic issues. And then in track 3 and also track 4. So thanks everyone for your input. Looking forward to seeing all of you at the next session next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you, Kenneth.